She was the most powerful woman in the world. She had 9 children. She would outlive 3 of them. And the first of those 3 would die on the exact same day, the same date, as the husband she had spent the previous 17 years mourning. She ruled an empire that covered a quarter of the planet. She gave birth to 9 children in 17 years. She arranged marriages with every reigning house in Europe. And she carried in her body, without ever knowing it, a single broken gene that would eventually help destroy the Russian Empire. How does the mother of European royalty end up burying her own children, then watching from beyond the grave as the disease she carried killed her grandchildren and great-grandchildren thousands of miles away? Her name was Queen Victoria, and what happened to her 9 children, 3 of whom would die before her, one of whom carried a disease no one in 1853 even had a name for, and one of whom would spend the last 30 years of her own life burning her mother's private diaries, page by page, in a courtyard at Osborne House, is the quietest, most devastating chapter of the entire 19th century. Over the next 40 minutes, you'll find out what her son Bertie did in a tent at the Curragh camp in 1861. A single weekend with a single Irish actress that Victoria would blame, for the rest of her own life, for her husband Albert's death 3 months later. Why her youngest son, Leopold, was forbidden to run, to climb, to play, to do anything a child does, and what doctors discovered about his own blood only after his body was brought back from Cannes, and what her youngest daughter, Beatrice, spent the last 3 decades of her life doing in the privacy of a small bonfire at Osborne House. A methodical, daily destruction of evidence that historians today will never be able to recover. What you're about to hear isn't a story about a queen. It's a story about what happens when a mother who controlled the marriages of every royal house in Europe couldn't, in the end, control the bodies of the children she had brought into the world. And it begins, like so many royal tragedies, with a date on the calendar. December 14th. Remember that date. It's coming back. She was 18 when she became Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It was the morning of June 20th, 1837. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain had ridden through the night from Windsor to Kensington Palace. They were received in a small sitting room. The young woman they had come to inform, a slight, dark-haired girl barely 5 feet tall, dressed in a hastily wrapped white nightgown, had listened to them in silence. She thanked them. She asked for an hour alone. She used that hour to write, in her diary, 3 sentences, that she was very young and in some things inexperienced, but that very few people had more genuine goodwill and a more real wish to do what was right than she did. She didn't write about her mother. She didn't write about her tutor. She didn't write about the empire that had just become hers. Instead, she wrote about the man who hadn't yet entered her life. And here's the part of Queen Victoria's life that almost every biographer rushes past, because it doesn't fit the black-clad Iron Widow she'd become in old age. Young Victoria, in the years before her marriage, was passionate, almost helplessly romantic. She filled her private diaries with sketches of her German cousin Albert. She had met him exactly twice. She had decided at 17 that she would marry him, decided it before he had decided anything at all. She married him on February 10, 1840. She was 20. He was 21. She gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Victoria, nicknamed Vicky, 9 months and 12 days later, on November 21, 1840. She would give birth to 8 more children over the following 16 years. And inside that first newborn, a small, dark-haired princess who would grow up to become Empress of Germany, a single broken gene, inherited from Victoria's own bloodline, was already present, asleep, silent. Victoria didn't know it was there. In her 81 years of life, she would never fully understand what she had passed on. But by the time the last surviving descendant carrying that gene died in Spain in 1938, more than half a century after Victoria's own death, it would have killed at least 9 of her great-grandchildren and helped bring down 2 royal dynasties. She didn't know. She wouldn't know until it was too late. The first 10 years of her marriage to Albert were, by every public account, the happiest decade of 19th-century European royalty. They lived between three homes: Buckingham Palace in London, Windsor Castle on the Thames, and a private estate Albert himself had designed at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. In 1852 they acquired a fourth, Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. Every morning they worked side by side at twin desks in Albert's study. He read the dispatches, drafted the speeches. He advised her on legislation, on foreign policy, on managing her own ministers. He was, in everything but name, co-monarch of an empire that already covered nearly a fifth of the Earth's surface. He was also her husband, and by the standards of any 19th-century marriage, royal or otherwise, they were extraordinarily, almost embarrassingly in love. At their private cottage at Osborne House, Albert had built 9 separate bathing huts on the beach, one for each of their children. He'd designed them himself. He'd chosen the wood. He'd commissioned small bronze plaques engraved with each child's name. The huts faced the Solent. They had glass windows. On summer mornings, the whole family walked down to them in single file. Victoria in front, Albert behind, the 9 children in order of age between them. The pressure to produce heirs was relentless. Vicky was born in 1840. Bertie, the future Edward VII, in 1841. Alice in 1843. Alfred, nicknamed Affy, in 1844. Helena, nicknamed Lenchen, in 1846. Louise in 1848. Arthur in 1850. Leopold in 1853. And finally Beatrice, whom her mother called baby for the rest of her own long life, in 1857. 9 children in 17 years. By the time Beatrice was born in April 1857, Queen Victoria was 38. By any reasonable medical count, she had been pregnant for more than 72 of the previous 203 months of her marriage. She had never breastfed any of her children. She didn't believe in it. In a private letter to her eldest daughter Vicky in 1859, she'd call nursing the ruin of the most refined and intellectual young lady, and would say she'd always found babies, especially very small ones, frightful when undressed. And the diary entry Victoria wrote the morning after her own wedding night in February 1840, an entry so explicit, so emotionally exposed, so completely at odds with the Iron Widow she would become, was an entry her youngest daughter Beatrice, 60 years later, personally cut from the bound diary and burned in a bonfire at Osborne House. We will never know what it said. To understand the Victoria the world saw at her height, the Victoria who stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony on the afternoon of May 1, 1851, watching the great exhibition open the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, her 4 eldest children around her and her husband Albert at her side, you have to understand what she'd already built by 31. She had ruled Britain for 14 years. She had survived 7 assassination attempts. She had given birth to 7 children, all of them, that May morning in 1851, alive and healthy. She had turned her husband into the most influential consort in the history of the English monarchy. Together they had built a model of the modern royal family that would shape every reigning house in Europe for the next century. By every measurable standard, she had the most successful marriage and the most successful family in the entire Western world. She had everything. Everything. 10 years later, almost to the day, she would be a widow. Her husband would be dead at 42. Her son Bertie would be the man she publicly blamed, in private letters that survived the bonfires, for a death she couldn't bring herself to attribute to something as ordinary as illness. Her eldest daughter Vicky would be in Berlin, 3 months pregnant with a son who would grow up to start a world war. And the perfect little family she'd gathered on that balcony in 1851 would already, beneath the surface, be coming apart. There's a photograph from the summer of 1857. It was taken at Osborne House, in the garden in front of Albert's private cottage, by a royal photographer named Leonida Caldesi. Victoria sits in a wicker chair. She's 38. On her lap is 4-month-old Beatrice, the last child she would bear. Albert stands behind her, one hand on her shoulder. Around them, in a careful semicircle arranged by Caldesi himself, are the other 8 children. Vicky is at the back, 16, already engaged to marry the future German emperor. Bertie is beside her, 15, smiling at the camera. Alice, 14. Affie, 12. Lenchen, 10. Louise, 8. Arthur, 7. And Leopold, small, pale, almost translucent, 4 years old, sits cross-legged in the grass at his mother's feet. What almost no Queen Victoria biographer has fully addressed is that the photograph from that afternoon at Osborne House was, by the time Victoria herself died in January 1901, the only surviving image of all 9 of her children together and in good health. By the time she lay dying at Osborne 44 years later, 3 of the children in that photograph were already in their graves. Because something Albert told her privately, the night before that family photograph was taken, something he never repeated in public, something Victoria would carry to her own grave, would explain why, after his death, she could never look at a photograph of her own family without flinching. Before going further, there's something to understand about Queen Victoria. She never believed she would survive the loss of her husband. She'd said so in her diary. She'd said so in her letters. She'd said it repeatedly to her ladies-in-waiting and to her own mother before her mother died. The day Albert died, she said, would be the day Victoria herself effectively ceased to exist. That day was coming. 4 years away. And the man she believed would cause it was her own eldest son. The summer of 1861 was, by every outward appearance, a summer of celebration for the British royal family. Princess Alice, 18, gentle and intellectually serious, the third of Victoria and Albert's 9 children, had formally become engaged in April to Prince Louis of Hesse and by Rhine. The wedding was set for the following summer at Osborne House. Her trousseau was already being assembled in Paris. Princess Vicky, now 23 years into her own marriage to the future German Emperor Frederick III and mother of 2 young children, had returned to Windsor for the summer with her husband and newborn son Wilhelm. Prince Albert was 41. He'd been prince consort for 21 years. By the summer of 1861, he was the most powerful and the most quietly resented German in British public life. He was tired. By his own admission to his wife in private letters, he was suffering chronic stomach pain. He hadn't slept well in nearly 2 years. But he was alive. He was working. He was planning the next phase of his son Bertie's beloved military training. In Albert's private study at Windsor Castle that summer hung, above his desk, a single object no Victoria biographer has ever satisfactorily explained. A small framed pencil sketch, drawn by Albert himself, signed and dated 1859, of his eldest son Bertie asleep in an armchair. He'd drawn it during one of Bertie's rare quiet afternoons at home. Beneath the sketch, in Albert's own hand, was a single line in German. Was Word aus diesem Jungen? What will become of this boy? He would not live to find out. Because in early September 1861, 3 months before Albert's death, Bertie would do something at a military camp in Ireland that, according to his own mother, killed the man who had drawn that sketch of him sleeping. The military camp was at the Curragh, in County Kildare, Ireland, in the autumn of 1861, the largest military training facility in the British Isles. Albert had personally arranged for his 19-year-old son to spend 10 weeks there with the Grenadier Guards. The official goal was to give the future king his first real exposure to military command. The unofficial goal, discussed only between Albert and Victoria, in letters that survived the later bonfires, was to expose Bertie to the discipline, structure, and moral seriousness of camp life. Albert believed his son was lazy. He believed Bertie was easily distracted. He believed Bertie was, in some persistent if unspecified way, unfit for the throne. Bertie arrived at the Curragh in late June 1861. He didn't enjoy it. He was small for his age. He felt awkward in uniform. By every account from his fellow officers, he was likable but unimpressive. His fellow officers decided to help him out. And here's the part of Bertie's biography that has been documented in extraordinary detail, by his own letters, by the official inquiry conducted in November 1861, and by the diaries of 3 different officers stationed at the Curragh that autumn. On the night of September 6, 1861, 3 of Bertie's fellow officers smuggled a young Irish actress named Nellie Clifton into the heir apparent's tent. She was 22. By all accounts from those who'd known her in Dublin's theaters, she was lively and quick-witted. She spent the night in Bertie's tent. She came back the following weekend. She came back, in fact, every weekend for the remaining 6 weeks of his posting. Bertie said nothing to his father, said nothing to his mother. He returned to Cambridge in late October 1861, resumed his studies, attended chapel, and wrote to his sister Vicky in Berlin that the Curragh had been more agreeable than I had feared. But the officers at the Curragh had told other officers. Those officers had told their wives. Their wives had told their friends. By the 2nd week of November 1861, the story had reached London. By the 3rd week, Buckingham Palace. By the 4th, Albert. By the time Albert received the report, he was already physically unwell. He'd been complaining of stomach pain, headaches, insomnia since late October. His personal physician, Sir James Clark, had recommended bed rest. Albert had refused. On the morning of November 25, 1861, 3 days after the full report on Bertie's conduct at the Curragh reached him, Albert boarded a train in cold rain, traveled to Cambridge, and personally confronted his 19-year-old son about the actress in the tent. He returned to Windsor that night. By the next morning he had a fever. He never recovered. And the Irish actress who had spent 6 weekends in the heir apparent's tent at the Curragh, Nellie Clifton, 22, lively and quick-witted, would, by the end of December 1861, be written into Queen Victoria's private correspondence as the woman who had killed her husband. Victoria never named her publicly, never wrote her name aloud. But in the letters Victoria wrote to her eldest daughter Vicky in Berlin in the weeks after Albert's death, she referred to Nellie only as that wretched creature. And her son Bertie she would mention, for the rest of her own life, in those same letters, with 3 different words. I never can or shall look at him without a shudder. Prince Albert died at 10:50 on the night of Saturday, December 14, 1861. The official cause of death, recorded by Sir James Clark and entered into the royal family's register 3 days later, was typhoid fever. Modern medical historians have, over the past half-century, proposed several alternative diagnoses. Chronic kidney failure, Crohn's disease, even an undiagnosed abdominal cancer that may have been growing inside him for years before the trip to Cambridge accelerated his decline. The truth has never been fully established. He was buried before any autopsy was permitted. But what is documented, what was witnessed by every adult member of the royal household present at Windsor Castle that night, was this. Princess Alice was at her father's bedside. She had been there, almost continuously, for 11 days. She was 18. She had nursed him through the fever, through the delirium, through the long silent hours when the doctors had nothing left to offer and Victoria herself had withdrawn, weeping, to the next room. Alice had read to him. Alice had cooled his forehead. Alice had held his hand. At approximately 10:30 that night, Albert opened his eyes for the last time. He looked at his daughter. He could no longer speak. He lifted his right hand from the sheets, slowly, deliberately, and placed it, palm down, over hers. He held it there. By Alice's own account, given in a private letter to her sister Vicky 3 days later, he kept his hand on hers for nearly 20 minutes before his breathing changed. She didn't move. She didn't call her mother. She stayed still. Victoria entered the room at approximately 10:40. She'd been summoned by her lady-in-waiting. She had run from her private apartments in her nightgown, her hair loose. She was 42. She knelt by the bed. She took her husband's other hand. He died 10 minutes later. He never spoke again, never regained consciousness, by any account from anyone present in the room. And here is what every reliable witness of that night documented, and what Victoria herself would refuse, for the next 40 years, to publicly acknowledge. The last person Albert was aware of, the last hand he held, the last face he looked at, whatever name he may or may not have whispered, was not his wife. It was his daughter. Alice was 18. She had nursed him for 11 days. She would never fully recover from those 11 days emotionally. And she would die, as we'll see, exactly 17 years later to the day, of a disease she caught while nursing her own dying son. Victoria's grief was, by any modern psychological standard, pathological. She didn't appear in public for 3 years. She didn't enter Parliament for more than a decade. She wore black every day for the remaining 39 years of her life. She slept with a photograph of Albert on the pillow beside her. Every morning, for the next 40 years, she had his bedclothes laid out and hot water brought to his washstand at the same hour, as if he were still alive. And what Albert had told her, the night before that family photograph at Osborne House in 1857, what he'd whispered to her in their bedroom, in the privacy of a marriage the world would never fully see inside, was a single line Victoria recorded in her diary that night. The entry survived the bonfires. It said, in essence, that watching the children in the garden, he feared he had been a poor father to them, that he had loved them, but never understood them. She told him that wasn't true. He didn't answer. The 4 years that followed were, by her own private admission, the closest Victoria came to wanting her own life to end. She didn't want to live. Letter after letter to Vicky in Berlin spoke of longing to be with him. She refused to wear color, refused public engagements. For the first 3 years she refused even to sign state documents without weeping over them at her desk. She withdrew, almost entirely, to Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. It was at Balmoral, in the autumn of 1864, almost 3 years to the day after Albert's death, that her physician Sir William Jenner suggested she might find some psychological benefit in the company of a former Highland servant who had once accompanied Albert on his deer-stalking expeditions. The servant's name was John Brown. He was 38, tall, powerfully built, red-bearded, and utterly indifferent to royalty. From their first meeting he called the Queen of the United Kingdom woman. She never corrected him. What John Brown was to Queen Victoria for the next 18 years, until his own death in 1883, has been the most rumored, most denied, most quietly investigated relationship in 19th century British royal history. Whether they were lovers, whether they secretly married, or whether their bond was simply the deepest platonic friendship of Victoria's adult life has never been established. We'll come back to him, because something John Brown said to Victoria at Balmoral, on a single afternoon in the autumn of 1865, about her son Bertie, would permanently change what Victoria allowed herself to feel about her own children. But before we get to Bertie's story, and before we return to the date this video opened with, we need to talk about a small boy named Leopold. He was born April 7, 1853, at Buckingham Palace, the 8th of Victoria and Albert's 9 children, their 4th son. He was named Leopold George Duncan Albert, after his godfather, the King of the Belgians. By every account from the medical team present, the birth was the most physically difficult of Victoria's 9 labors. Her personal physician, Dr. John Snow, the same John Snow who, just 2 years earlier, had traced the source of London's cholera outbreak, was permitted to administer chloroform during the final stages. In 1853, this was controversial. The Church of England had publicly criticized pain relief in childbirth as a violation of Genesis's instruction that women bring children into the world in pain. Victoria ignored them. She'd been in labor more than 12 hours. The boy who emerged at the end of those 12 hours was, by every outward measure, perfectly formed. He weighed about 7 pounds. He cried. He nursed. He slept. But inside his small body, present from the moment of conception, encoded in a single broken protein his mother had passed on without knowing she carried it, was a disease no doctor in 1853 had a name for, that no medical textbook of the era had fully described, and that, by the time Leopold was 4, would have turned his entire childhood into a slow, careful, anguished education in everything he was forbidden to do. Here's what doctors in 1853 still didn't understand. Hemophilia is a recessive genetic disorder carried on the X chromosome. It prevents blood from clotting normally. A small bruise, a fall from a chair, a stumble on a staircase, a scraped knee in the garden. In a hemophiliac child, any of these can become a bleeding episode that won't stop on its own. It has to be managed with external pressure, with ice, and in the 19th century, before any modern treatment existed, by the simple and terrifying expedient of waiting for the body to do what it had been born unable to do. The first severe bleeding episode happened when Leopold was about 14 months old. He'd fallen from a small chair in the nursery at Buckingham Palace and cut his lip on the corner of the chair. By any normal child's standard, the cut was minor, maybe half an inch long, a few millimeters deep. It bled for nearly 4 hours. Royal physicians were summoned. Pressure was applied. Cold cloths were brought. By every account from the household staff present, Victoria herself sat on the nursery floor for the full 4 hours, holding her son in her lap, watching him grow steadily paler as blood soaked through one cloth after another. The bleeding finally stopped around 3 in the morning. Leopold survived. And the broken gene Victoria had carried in her own body since her own conception in 1818, a gene inherited from a father we'll never definitively identify, a gene that had stayed silent and undetected in her for 34 years before expressing itself in her 8th child, was, that night in the nursery in 1854, finally announced to the world. Doctors still had no name for what was wrong with Leopold. They wouldn't for almost another decade. But by dawn they knew something was very wrong. And they knew, whatever it was, it came from his mother. Leopold was forbidden to run, forbidden to climb trees, forbidden to ride except at a walk, forbidden to swim, forbidden to play with toy swords. By his 13th year, forbidden any sport involving physical contact of any kind. He was, however, allowed to read. And he read everything. By 14, Leopold spoke fluent French and German. By 18, he'd been admitted to Christ Church, Oxford, the only one of Victoria's 9 children to attend a British university. He studied modern history, attended John Ruskin's lectures, and became friends with the writer Lewis Carroll, who would later dedicate one of his books to Leopold's memory. By every account from his university friends, he was also the sharpest of all Victoria's children. Perceptive, sardonic, uniquely willing among the royal siblings to say privately what nearly every member of the British aristocracy was thinking but would never say aloud about Victoria's public mourning, her refusal to appear at state functions, and her ongoing, unrelenting treatment of her own eldest son Bertie. Leopold kept a private diary through his 3 years at Oxford, writing daily in 3 different languages: English for routine entries, German for emotional ones, and a cipher of his own invention for entries he didn't want any household servant to be able to read. The diaries survive today in the Royal Archives at Windsor. They've been examined by exactly 4 scholars in the past century. None has published a full transcription, because what Leopold wrote in cipher, in his own hand, in pencil, in the final third of the surviving 3rd volume, was a series of observations about his own mother that, published in his lifetime, would have caused a constitutional crisis. He never meant for them to be read. He died before he could destroy them. And the existence of those entries remains, more than a century later, one of the most quietly guarded secrets in the Royal Archives. He left Oxford in 1876. He asked to serve as his mother's private secretary. She refused. She already had Beatrice, then 19, filling that role, and wouldn't displace her. He asked for a diplomatic posting abroad. She refused. The climate, she said, would kill him. He asked permission to marry a young Englishwoman he'd been quietly in love with since 1872, Helen of Waldeck and Pyrmont. She refused that too, for nearly 6 years, before finally relenting in 1881. The wedding took place in April 1882. He had 3 years left to live. Princess Alice, Victoria's third child, the daughter who had held Albert's hand as he died, who had nursed him for 11 days in December 1861, had married Prince Louis of Hesse in July 1862, 7 months after her father's death. She moved to Darmstadt. She gave birth to 7 children in 14 years. She named her second daughter, born in June 1872, Alex Victoria Helena Louise Beatrice, after her mother, her own grandmother, and her 2 living sisters. That girl would grow up to marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and become Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. She would carry in her own body the same broken gene her grandmother Queen Victoria had carried, the gene that had killed her uncle Leopold, that would destroy her own son, that would help bring down the entire Russian Empire. But that's a story for another video. In November 1878, Alice was 35, living at the new palace in Darmstadt with Louis and their 7 children. In the second week of November, the youngest of those 7, a 4-year-old girl named May, fell ill with what the family doctor first thought was a cold. It was diphtheria. It tore through the household with terrifying speed. By the 3rd week of November, 6 of the 7 children were sick. By the end of the month, 3 were critical. On November 16, 1878, 4-year-old May died. Alice had nursed her dying daughter alone, in a small second-floor bedroom, through the child's final 2 days. And here's the part of Princess Alice's death documented by every reliable witness, by her husband Louis, by the family doctor, Dr. Eigenbrot, and by Alice herself, in the last letters she wrote in early December 1878. After May died, Alice gathered her surviving children to tell them. The doctor had instructed her not to touch them physically. Diphtheria was, by then, understood to be highly contagious. She'd agreed. She stood in the doorway. She began to speak. And then her eldest son, Ernie, 10 years old, began to cry. He ran to his mother, threw his arms around her neck. And Alice, exhausted, grieving, unable to push him away, kissed him on the forehead. She contracted diphtheria within 48 hours. She died December 14, 1878, 17 years, to the exact day, after her father had died in her arms. December 14th had come back. Victoria, at Windsor, 90 miles from the train station where the last letters from her dying daughter had arrived, wrote a single line in her diary that night: "This terrible day come round again." Princess Louise, Victoria's 6th child and 4th daughter, was the most artistically gifted of all the royal siblings. A sculptor who'd trained at the National Art Training School in South Kensington, the only one of Victoria's daughters to receive formal artistic education. By 22, she'd completed a marble bust of her mother that still stands today in the main hall of Kensington Palace. She married the Marquis of Lorne, a Scottish aristocrat and future 9th Duke of Argyll, in March 1871, the first commoner to marry a British princess in more than 300 years. The marriage produced no children. And here's what has been the most quietly investigated and most consistently denied chapter of Princess Louise's life. By every reliable account from household staff who served the couple between 1871 and the Marquis's death in 1914, the marriage was never sexually consummated. Whether this was due to the Marquis's own inclinations, persistent rumors circulated throughout his life about romantic interest in other men, or to an injury Louise had suffered in childhood, or to a private arrangement the two had reached together, has never been established. The household doctor who treated Louise from 1871 until his own death in 1939, Dr. Reed, who served the royal family for more than 40 years, kept careful notes on every family member he treated. Those notes survive in the royal archives today. The pages devoted to Princess Louise have been sealed, by order of the current royal household, until 2039. We don't know what Dr. Reed recorded, only that he recorded enough that the current household has decided we still aren't permitted to read it. But Louise's silence about her own marriage, and her doctor's silence, wasn't the silence that would, in the next decade of Victoria's life, break her completely. That silence belonged to her son Leopold. Leopold, then 30, married 23 months, father of an 11-month-old daughter named Alice, traveled to the south of France in March 1884 on his doctor's recommendation. The English winter had been hard on him. He'd bled from minor injuries twice in January and once in early February. He needed warmth, needed stillness. His wife Helen, 8 months pregnant with their second child, stayed behind at Claremont House in Surrey. Leopold arrived in Cannes on March 22nd. He settled into the Cercle Nautique, a small private club on the waterfront, and spent his first 3 days reading, walking slowly along the Croisette, dining quietly. On the morning of March 27th, he slipped on a tiled floor at the club. He fell, striking his head on the corner of a marble step. The cut was small. At first the bleeding didn't seem serious. They put him to bed. He died at 3:30 the morning of March 28, 1884, of a cerebral hemorrhage. The local doctor, with no understanding of his hereditary condition, was completely unable to stop. He was 30 years old. The broken gene Victoria had passed to her son Leopold, without ever knowing she carried it. The gene that had made his entire short life a careful negotiation with his own bloodstream had finally killed him. He left behind a daughter who wouldn't remember him. He left behind a wife who, for months later, would give birth to the son he'd never see. And he left behind a mother who, at 64, was only just beginning to understand what she had given all her children. John Brown died March 27, 1883. He'd been ill less than a week. The official cause of death, recorded by the household physician Sir William Jenner, was erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection that in 1883 was nearly always fatal in older patients. He was 56. He'd been at Queen Victoria's side almost continuously for 19 years. Victoria, then 63, 4 years after Alice's death, 11 years before her own, was inconsolable. 3 days after Brown's death, she wrote to Vicky in Berlin that perhaps there had never before, in history, been such a strong and true attachment, such a warm and loving friendship between a sovereign and a servant, and that she felt life, for the second time, had become very hard and sad to bear, deprived of all she so needed. She had used that same word, deprived, only once before in her private correspondence. She had used it on December 15, 1861, the morning after Albert died. And here is what Queen Victoria did in the immediate aftermath of John Brown's death, something no British monarch had ever done before for a Highland servant. She commissioned a marble statue of him and had it placed in the gardens at Balmoral, on the spot where he used to stand every morning to receive her instructions. She wrote a private memoir of him, a manuscript of roughly 300 pages, in her own hand, that she intended to publish. She was stopped, after a year of increasingly urgent private warnings, only by the direct personal intervention of her son Bertie and her private secretary Sir Henry Ponsonby. At Bertie's insistence, the manuscript was locked away in a cabinet at Windsor Castle. By his orders, after her own death in 1901, it was destroyed. And what John Brown had told Victoria at Balmoral, on a single afternoon in the autumn of 1865, about her son Bertie, the boy she'd publicly blamed for his father's death, was a single line she recorded in a private letter to Vicky in Berlin 2 weeks later. The letter survived the bonfires. Brown had told her that the boy was no more guilty of his father's death than he himself was, that Bertie grieved just as she did, the only difference being that she had allowed herself to say so, and he hadn't. Victoria didn't respond, but she never again referred to Bertie publicly as the cause of Albert's death. She never apologized to him in person. She never fully forgave him. But she stopped saying it out loud. Prince Alfred, nicknamed Affy, Victoria's second eldest son and fourth child, had married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia in January 1874, the only daughter of Tsar Alexander II, uniting the British and Russian royal families for the first time in over a century. The marriage produced 5 children. The eldest and only son was a boy named Alfred Jr., born October 1874. By every account from the household, he was the most physically striking of all Victoria's grandchildren. He resembled his father, had his mother's pale gray eyes, and by 14 was fluent in English, German, French, and Russian. By his early 20s, according to every account from his fellow officers in the Prussian army where he was eventually commissioned, he was also quietly, gravely depressed. The exact circumstances of what happened at Meiningen, in central Germany, on the night of January 22, 1899, have never been fully documented. The official account from the Coburg court physician states that the 24-year-old Prince Alfred Jr. had been suffering from a chronic respiratory illness, that he'd been confined to bed by his doctors, and that his death, on February 6, 1899, resulted from natural causes accelerated by heavy drinking. The unofficial account, given in private letters by 3 different members of the Coburg household over the following decade, says that on the night of January 22, in his private rooms at Schloss Friedenstein, Prince Alfred Jr. attempted to take his own life with a revolver. He didn't die instantly. He survived 14 days before dying on February 6, 1899. He was 24. Affi, then 54, the reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and the only one of Victoria's sons still actively reigning anywhere in Europe, was never quite the same, by every account from the household staff, after that month. And the last letter young Alfred had written before that January night, found in his desk drawer 3 days after his death, addressed to his mother but never sent, was a letter that the Coburg household, on Affi's direct orders, never returned to its intended recipient. Maria Alexandrovna wouldn't see her son's last words for more than a decade. The letter survived. In it, he told his mother he could no longer live in this body, that he was sorry, that he had tried. Affi was diagnosed with throat cancer in May 1900. His doctors believed it had been growing inside him for years. By then it was inoperable. He died July 30, 1900, at 55, the second of Victoria's 9 children to die before her, 22 years after the first, Alice, on the date that kept returning. The third would die 7 months after Victoria herself. The third was Vicky, Victoria's eldest child, the Princess Royal, the Empress Frederick of Germany, mother of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the grandson who, 14 years after his own mother's death, would lead Germany into a war against the country of his grandmother's birth. She had married Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia in January 1858, 17 years old, pregnant within a year. In January 1859 she gave birth to a son, Wilhelm, whose left arm had been catastrophically damaged during a breech delivery, an injury Wilhelm would conceal under specially tailored uniforms for the rest of his life. She gave birth to 8 children in total. She became Empress of Germany in March 1888, for 99 days, before her husband Frederick III died of throat cancer. Their eldest son, Wilhelm, then 29, ascended the throne and almost immediately began systematically isolating his own mother from German political life, from the German court, from her own home at Friedrichshof, the small castle she had built outside Frankfurt with the inheritance her father Albert had left her 30 years before. She lived at Friedrichshof from 1894 onward. She lived there alone. In early 1899, at 58, at the same time her brother Affi's only son was dying at Meiningen, at the same time her own mother, Queen Victoria, was beginning her final decline at Osborne House. Vicky was diagnosed with spinal cancer. Her German doctors gave her less than 3 years. She didn't tell her mother. She told no one in England for nearly 2 years. She kept writing her weekly letters to Victoria, letters she'd written without interruption since her own marriage in 1858, letters that by 1899 numbered in the thousands. She wrote about the weather, about her grandchildren, about the gardens at Friedrichshof. She didn't write about the disease slowly destroying her spine, vertebra by vertebra. And the way Vicky's most private letters, the ones containing her real condition, her real pain, her real terror of dying alone in a country whose new emperor was her own son, who had forbidden her doctors to give her the morphine her trusted English physicians had recommended, made it out of Friedrichshof and into England was through a system her loyal English equerry, a man named Frederick Ponsonby, devised himself. The letters were sewn into the leather lining of saddles. The saddles were carried by trusted couriers across the German border. They were delivered to Windsor Castle late at night. 2 of them survive today in the Royal Archives. The rest were never recovered. Queen Victoria died first. She died January 22, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She was 81. She had reigned 63 years and 7 months. In her final hour, she was attended by her physician Sir James Reed, by her son Bertie, then 59, the man she had spent 40 years refusing to forgive, who within the hour would become King Edward VII, and by her grandson Wilhelm, the German emperor, who had traveled from Berlin to be at her bedside. She did not ask, in her final week, for her eldest daughter Vicky. Vicky was too ill to travel. By January 1901, she'd lost the use of her legs, confined to a wheelchair at Friedrichshof. Her own son, the emperor, had given strict instructions that she not be told when her mother's condition turned critical. He didn't want to upset her, and more precisely, didn't want her attempting the journey to England against her German doctor's orders. She learned of her mother's death by reading it in a German newspaper. And the letter Princess Alice had written to her own mother in November 1878, the letter she'd begun the morning after May died, the letter she was too ill from her own diphtheria to finish, was a letter Victoria didn't receive until 8 months after Alice's own death. It had been kept by the Hesse household doctor, sent through diplomatic channels. Victoria opened it alone, at Osborne House, on the morning of August 15, 1879. The letter ended mid-sentence. The last words Alice had written, words Victoria would carry, folded inside the cover of her own diary, for the remaining 22 years of her life, spoke of thinking lately about her father, and how he had held her hand at the end, and of wondering, all these years, whether in doing so he had meant to ask her to. The sentence was never finished. We don't know what Albert had been asking. We don't know what Alice believed he'd meant. We don't know what Victoria, reading the unfinished sentence in 1879, concluded. We only know she folded the letter in half, placed it inside the front cover of her diary, and never spoke of its contents to anyone for the rest of her life. Vicky survived her mother by exactly 226 days. She died August 5, 1901, at Friedrichshof. In the small second-floor bedroom she decorated herself in 1894 with English wallpaper imported from her mother's preferred London supplier. She was 60. Her final months had been marked by extraordinary pain. Her German doctors, on her son Kaiser Wilhelm's orders, had denied her the doses of morphine her English doctors had recommended. She had screamed. In her last 2 weeks she'd lost consciousness for hours at a time. Her brother Bertie, by then King Edward VII, visited in those final weeks, traveling to Friedrichshof in secret, against his nephew the Kaiser's formal protest, to be at his sister's side. Before leaving Germany, he arranged for the contents of Vicky's private desk to be smuggled out of the country, using the same system Vicky herself had devised, letters sewn into saddle linings. And those letters, carried out of Friedrichshof in the second week of August 1901, letters Bertie would later read alone, in his private study at Sandringham, in the months after his sister's funeral, revealed to him what their mother Victoria had spent 40 years refusing to see, or refusing to acknowledge. Vicky had loved her mother. She had also, in her most private moments, feared her. She had spent her entire adult life writing letters home that Victoria read and answered. Letters Vicky had, for 40 years, been quietly editing in real time to remove anything that might upset her mother. The Vicky her mother had known was, in the end, only one of 2 daughters who had lived inside that body. She was buried beside her husband Frederick III at the Friedenskirche in Potsdam. Her son Wilhelm never spoke of his mother in public again for the rest of his life. Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest child, the little girl her mother had called baby for the first 16 years of her own life, was 43 when her mother died. She had married a German prince, Henry of Battenberg, in July 1885. Victoria had violently opposed the match at first, relenting after 2 years only on condition that Beatrice and Henry live with her, permanently, in the royal residences. Beatrice agreed, spending the next 16 years of her marriage as her mother's full-time private secretary. Henry couldn't bear it. In late 1895, he volunteered for a British military expedition against the Ashanti in West Africa, wanting, by his own private admission to a fellow officer who survived him, to escape the suffocation of life inside Queen Victoria's household. He contracted malaria in January 1896 and died aboard a hospital ship in the Gulf of Benin on January 20, 1896. Beatrice was 38, with 4 children. She returned immediately to her mother's side and stayed there until Victoria's death 5 years later. And what Princess Beatrice did over the following 30 years of her own life, in the privacy of her rooms at Osborne House and Kensington Palace, under explicit, binding instructions her mother had left her in a final document signed 3 weeks before Victoria's death, was the most systematic, most determined act of historical destruction any member of the British royal family has ever undertaken. She edited every page of Queen Victoria's private diaries. By January 1901, the diaries filled more than 120 bound volumes, written almost daily for nearly 70 years, containing, by the most conservative estimate of historians who later tried to reconstruct them, more than 2.5 million words. Beatrice rewrote them. By hand, from the originals, she copied each page into new bound volumes, editing as she went, cutting, by her own judgment, every passage she believed her mother wouldn't have wanted made public. She cut references to John Brown, cut references to Princess Louise's marriage, cut references to Bertie's conduct at the Curragh, cut references to Albert's private fears about his children, cut references to Leopold's medical condition before his diagnosis, cut references to her own father's final hours that didn't match the public account. And every page she finished rewriting, she burned, in a small bonfire in the courtyard of the King's Cottage at Osborne House, daily, by her own private record, for 30 years, from the spring of 1901 until her own physical decline in 1932. And the diary entry Queen Victoria had written the morning after her own wedding night in February 1840. The entry so explicit, so emotionally exposed, so completely at odds with the Iron Widow she'd become, was the very first page Beatrice burned. She burned it April 14, 1901, 82 days after her mother's death, on the same bonfire she would use for the next 30 years. We will never know what it said. We will never know what Victoria felt about her husband the morning after their wedding, what passed between them in the private hours of the night before. The one original document that could have answered that question was, by mid-morning on April 14, 1901, ash on a small slab in a courtyard on the Isle of Wight. And the ciphered entries Leopold had written in the final third of his Oxford diary, the entries containing his observations about his own mother, entries that would have caused a constitutional crisis had they been published in his lifetime, were the second category of documents Beatrice was instructed to destroy. In the end, she didn't burn them. She separated them from the rest of the diary, sealed them in an envelope, and sent them to the Royal Archives at Windsor with a single instruction, that they not be read in any present generation. They haven't been published. They remain sealed today. What Princess Beatrice burned in her courtyard at Osborne House, the diaries, the letters, the photographs, the documents her mother instructed her to destroy, amounted, by the most conservative estimate of historians who've tried to account for what's missing, to more than 2/3 of the surviving private record of the most documented life of the entire 19th century. We don't know what Queen Victoria privately thought about most of the people she loved most. The bonfires in the Osborne House courtyard made sure we never would. Remember the date we asked you to remember at the start of this video? December 14th. The night Prince Albert died holding his daughter Alice's hand, in 1861. The night his daughter Alice died, of diphtheria caught from a kiss she gave her own dying son, exactly 17 years later. Queen Victoria, who outlived her husband by 40 years, who outlived 3 of her own 9 children, who ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen, who carried in her body a single broken gene that would help destroy the Russian Empire, the Spanish royal line, and the German monarchy her own grandson would lead into a world war, never once wrote, in her surviving diary, about the fact that the two people she'd loved most in her entire life had died on the same day, in the same week of the calendar. Beatrice may have cut it, or Victoria may simply never have been able to bring herself to write it down. She gave birth to 9 children in 17 years. She arranged their marriages with every reigning house in Europe. Together with her husband Albert, she built the model of the modern royal family that every monarchy on the continent would copy for the next century. By the time of her death, she controlled the political fate of nearly a third of the human population. And in the end, in a small bedroom at Osborne House, on a January morning in 1901, with her son the new king and her grandson the German emperor at her bedside, she became exactly what every mother who outlives her own children becomes. Silent. Alone. Survived.